Hello and welcome. Netherbutton in the parish of Ham is a famous name in modern Orkney history. It's the site of the transmitter that first brought us television and then, 45 years ago, BBC Radio Orkney. The story of the transmitter tower goes right back to the days of wartime radar, where it turns out that Orkney was in the forefront of development. So much so, indeed, that when the Royal Oak stayed in Scapa Flow in October 1939, when the rest of the fleet sailed, there was a very good reason. Her powerful anti-aircraft guns were needed to protect the new Netherbutton radar station. Someone who is ideally placed to tell us about the story of Netherbutton and the events and people in its history, and indeed the whole historical context, is Ian Brown, who is an acknowledged authority on the history of radar. Ian is the curator at the National Museum of Flight at East Fortune in East Lothian. He's been there for 17 years as part of his work with the National Museums of Scotland. He studied history at Stirling University and took a master's degree in museum studies at Leicester. He's worked on a number of exhibition projects, most recently leading a big redevelopment of 2 hangars at the Flight Museum. Ian's latest book, Radar in Scotland, 1938 to 46, was published earlier this year by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and it's the result of more than 35 years of research. So, Ian, welcome indeed. And can I start off by asking you a bit more about the book and all the many years of work that you put into it? Indeed, first of all, what started off your interest in the whole story of radar?
Hi, Howie. Ian. Thanks for that lovely introduction. With most things, it's a bit of a long story. Going back to when I was a young teenager back in the distant past. And I was in the Air Training Corps and started to do the Duke of Edinburgh Award. And one of the parts of that is, I think it's classed as a skill. Basically, you have to do a sort of project for 6 months. And I decided that I would look at the sort of wartime history of the Scottish borders. So, Home Guard, there was ICI had an incendiary bomb factory near St Boswell's, various other things, but it included 3 radar stations on the Berwickshire coast. And within a few months, I'd managed to trace a couple of people who'd served there and got a bit of information and some photographs. And I can remember quite clearly writing to the RAF Museum to see what information they had. And they gave me some basic details of what the stations were, the types of radar that they had, which I knew. And they said, oh, we can't actually give you any photographs because we don't have, it was all very secret. Basically, you could be shot for taking photographs of these sites. So we don't have anything. And as a young 16-year-old, who at that time thought national museums knew everything. Now that I work for one, I know that's not the case. But I already had a couple of photographs. So it kind of hit me at that point that, I actually know more than they do, that there's scope here to contribute to recorded history, which was kind of a big revelation for someone at that age. And it just basically took off from that. So a few years later, I made contact with a chap in Lincolnshire who'd set up a radar archive, and he'd done a lot of research, and we kind of started to work together. And sort of basically, it sort of took over. So I never did complete my Duke of Edinburgh Award, but the research kind of grew from that.
And just thinking about the images that would be in the photographs, some of those could be very striking images. I was just thinking of Netherbutton and how it indeed looked in the post-war years with those various tall steel transmitter towers.
Yeah, I mean, once I started looking at, as I say, I started with the Scottish borders, but it ended up kind of looking at basically the whole of Scotland, and I've done research on sites elsewhere as well. But when I started looking at Orkney, as many people will realise, one of the first places you really need to start with is the photo collection in the library. And there's the iconic image that many will have seen before of the 4 steel transmitter towers, which is an amazing image, as I say, because of the secrecy, but also because Netherbutton was an interesting station. It wasn't just your standard chain home early warning station. It had a much more interesting history. But what's also quite interesting about Netherbutton is it's not just the photographs of the station, but because of the landscape, there's so many photographs of other things. Things like the building of the barriers. Many of those photographs, you'll see these towers pop up in the background. So the Netherbutton appears on a lot more photographs than you might otherwise expect.
And the whole technology of radar seems to have advanced very rapidly during World War II, but presumably the underlying concept, the underlying idea behind it goes further back.
It's one of these things that basically in the early to mid 1930s, I suppose it kind of, in British terms, it goes back to, there was a speech by the Prime Minister at the time, Stanley Baldwin, in 1932, and I won't quote the whole speech, but there's a particular phrase where he says the bomber will always get through. And that was basically our ministry policy at the time, that it was a bit like, for those of us who remember the Cold War, the policy was mutual assured destruction, that there won't be a nuclear war because if you attack us, if you wipe us out with nuclear missiles, we'll wipe you out. And that was pretty much policy in the 1930s of, we will have a big enough bomber fleet so that if you bomb us, we'll flatten you, so that it was kind of seen as a deterrent. But eventually it was realised, as a result of some exercises as well, that it didn't matter what you did, you couldn't stop a bomber force knocking, essentially, yes, the fact that you could bomb them wouldn't stop the fact that you had been wiped out, so nobody wins. And that no matter how many fighters you had, there would always be bombers got through. So the Air Ministry started to consider this. So they asked some scientists, basically Henry Tizard, who was an expert in ballistics, so he'd done a lot of work on bomb ballistics, to look at see if there was a scientific solution to the problem. And at that time, there was a lot of mention in science fiction films, Flash Gordon, and the kind of films that kids would go and watch in the cinemas on a Saturday morning, of death rays. So it was kind of a common thing of in the future, in the same way that my generation, it was Star Wars, so you see all these blasters with firing lasers or whatever. There was a belief that perhaps science could provide the solution. So what they did was they approached some scientists, and the person approached, whose name becomes more prominent, is a scientist called Robert Watson-Watt at the National Physical Laboratory. And he was an expert on radio signals and had done a lot of work on thunderstorms and how they affected radio transmissions and things like that. And so they asked him, is there any way that we can... Well, they didn't actually go to him and say, can you create a death ray? They went to him and said, how much energy would be needed to raise the body temperature of, I think it was it 5 or 8 pints or whatever of water by 10 degrees. It was basically, he figured it out. They want to know how much energy it's going to take to boil the blood of a pilot. So he passed it to his assistant, who was a chap called Arnold Wilkins, who was important in the story but doesn't really get the glory. He did the calculations and realised that it was utterly impossible. They didn't have the technology to do it. But he remembered of a study that the Post Office had done a few years earlier, looking at radio transmissions, and they had noticed that whenever an aircraft flew near the radio stations, there was a flutter in the signal. And he remembered this, and he said, well, yeah, we can't destroy it. You can't either boil the blood of a pilot or interfere with the ignition of the engine or whatever. It's not possible. But we could probably detect aircraft from reflected radio signals. Watson Watt reported this back, and so they then asked him for more information. So they did the calculations, they showed it was possible, and then the Air Ministry said, right, well, we want a practical demonstration. So they arranged for the use of an RAF bomber to fly along a set path beside the BBC radio masts at Daventry. And they took a little van from the National Physical Laboratory, put a receiver in it, set up some aerials in a field, and in the middle of the night, went home, went back to the hotel, came back the next morning, and this bomber was going to do something, and if it interfered with the signal, they had proven that it was practically possible. And on the first pass, nothing happened. So you can imagine how tense it must have been in that little van, thinking, well, we've promised all this stuff to the Air Ministry, and turns out on that first pass, the pilot hadn't flown on the path that he was supposed to have flown. So on the second and third passes, they picked it up, proved that it was all practically possible. And the Air Ministry then took that to the Treasury, and I think the Treasury very quickly released, God, I'm trying to remember the figure now. It was either 10,000 or 50,000. I think it was £10,000 to begin with, which in 1935 is a huge amount of money to take that research further forward. And yeah, eventually they were able to fairly quickly detect aircraft at ever increasing ranges of 15, 20, 30 miles. And it was realised that this, with the right development, was going to provide a solution to providing early warning. And yeah, it then kind of more and more Treasury money was being spent on it, and yeah, developing the early warning chain as it became.
Well, indeed, so things must have moved really, really very fast. And was that happening in Britain alone, or were other countries doing some research in the field as well?
Yeah, I mean, it did happen very, very, very quickly. And I mean, the Treasury was spending, I mean, I have seen a figure for how much was spent in radar through the entire war, but I can't remember what, but it was several millions, which, was a lot in the 30s and 40s. But while it was a lot of money, one has to look at the alternative of it was either spend money on radar, which would mean we could have an effective small, the number of fighters would need to have standing patrols around the entire British coast, and the number of pilots was just would have been completely unaffordable. The alternative would have been to have had an overwhelmingly, if the enemy had 1,000 bombers, we'd have to have 10,000 bombers. So the cost of radar was actually massively, significantly less than that would have been. So I mean, you could argue it was the cheap option. But yeah, as you say, it wasn't just in Britain that radar was being developed, and one could argue that, I mean, the Germans in some respects started earlier. I mean, there was a chap called Christian Hulsmeyer who developed what he called a telemobiloscope, that was basically a collision warning system for ships, that it wouldn't tell you the range. So it wasn't, since radar is radio detection and ranging, so it detects something but also tells you where it is. If you just detect something, it's not technically radar. We had a device that would detect an object. So in theory, if it had been fitted to Titanic, it would have detected the iceberg. Whether they would have swerved to avoid it's another matter. I mean, the Germans were developing radar for military purposes about the same time as Britain. The interesting thing is the difference in approach, because I mean, a lot of books will say, well, why didn't the Germans destroy radar during the battle? And they did attack stations on the south coast, and there were attacks on other radar stations throughout the war. But actually, destroying a tower is actually quite difficult. But there's also the fact that the Germans had an entirely different approach to radar. They didn't see it as, certainly in the early days, they didn't see it as an early warning system to protect your coast. For them, it was a sort of a tool for target finding. So they had, once they'd sort of occupied Western Europe, they built a chain of radar stations, but they saw them as, well, we can use this to find ships in the Channel to then go and bomb, or to find British aircraft to go and shoot down. They didn't see it as a means of defending themselves. They saw it as a means of finding targets for them to attack. But they operated on very much shorter wavelengths, which, without getting into technical detail, Chain Home, which is what Netherbutton was, operated on a kind of a variation of commercial radio wavelengths, essentially. So it was about 11 meters. And this is it. Without going into all the technical, the longer the wavelength, the poorer the definition. So you can't pinpoint a target to within a few centimeters, sort of thing. The Germans mostly operated in 50 centimeters, which gave them much more precise targeting. That they didn't really understand what Chain Home was. They thought it was a system that kind of tied British aircraft to a rigid defensive system of radio control that didn't give them the flexibility. So they actually thought, A, it would be sort of detrimental to that RAF, but B, even once they did kind of start to understand what it was, they thought, well, actually, you know what, if this is telling them that we're coming and it's going to bring them up into combat, that's what we want. We want them to come and engage with us so that we can shoot them down and destroy the RAF. So they saw radar as actually doing a good job for them, because they wanted, they believed that they had better pilots, better aircraft. So anything that brought the RAF into combat was a good thing.
Well, that is fascinating. And the concept then of this chain home would be a kind of line of stations, each covering a section of the coast.
Yeah, I mean, the original the first station that was handed over to the RAF in 1937 was at Bodsey in Suffolk, which is where they had done most of the radar research. And it then became one of what they called the Thames Estuary chain. So there was 5 stations covering the Thames Estuary, funnily enough, that was handed over to the RAF between, from 37 to 38. But originally there was only 3 of them that both transmitted and received, and the other 2 were just transmitters only. So they kind of saw it was a sort of hybrid system. I mean, eventually they upgraded them all to be both transmitting and receiving. But that was their, the original chain that they could afford was just this one. That was in 1938. Then, with the Munich crisis in September 1938, as is always the case in any crisis, there was a bit of a panic. They rushed mobile units, which they were planning to start to send overseas to protect important bits of the empire. They realised that, there were important targets that could be reached from Germany that were vulnerable. So they set 3 units, one to Norfolk to cover the Wash, one to Yorkshire to cover the Humber, and one to Berwickshire, which is one of the ones that I started looking at when I was 16, to cover the Forth, because, at that time, in late 1938, they still hadn't really decided that Scapa Flow would be the war base for the Home Fleet. It was still going to be Rosyth, and it was only I think it was the very end of 38 or beginning of 1939 that decision was made. So at that point in time, it made sense. You cover the Forth because Rosyth will be the main Home Fleet base, and obviously, even when Scapa Flow took over that role, Rosyth was still an important destroyer base. So there was clearly a realisation that both the Royal Navy bases and the East Coast commercial shipping routes were of great importance.
So things would have moved really fast then once that decision was made that Scapa Flow would be the Navy's northern base. That would be a point in which it would be absolutely vital to have a radar station in Orkney.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's interesting that, I think it's interesting anyway. There was a meeting arranged by the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff in January 1939, and it was at that meeting that they decided to extend radar coverage beyond what had already been decided. And that was following the decision to make the wartime Home Fleet base be at Scapa Flow. And obviously there was an awareness that you can't have the main base of the Home Fleet there without there being some kind of early warning cover. But from that decision in January 1939 to the setting up of the station at Netherbutton took 5 months, which, under wartime conditions, that's a bit different. But bearing in mind this is still peacetime, how long would it take nowadays to do, to go through the whole planning process, and all the risk assessments and everything else, the Treasury approvals, for spending money. I mean, all the things that you'd have to take into account before something, a new military installation, which is incredibly secret, so you don't really want anyone to know about it, to set all that up. And from the highest level decision to it actually going on the air was well, it was actually about 4.5 months, I think, but it's just incredible, which gives some indication of just how urgent the matter was seen, even at the highest levels in the RAF.
And it contrasts with the very slow pace at which Scapa Flow's seaward defences were worked on in the years really between the two wars, as of course sadly was seen from the way in which the U-47 was able to find a way through those sea defences to sink the Royal Oak on the night of October 13th, 14th. Just a big contrast between the tremendous pace of radar and that slow pace on seaward defences.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things. I think. I mean, there's an old adage that the military always fights the previous war, and in some respects, winning a war is the worst thing that can happen because you then don't learn the lessons from it. And the fact that Scapa Flow, despite several attempts, was never successfully entered or attacked, or however you want to word it, during the First World War, I think led to a lot of complacency that, it was impregnable. There was all these block ships and boom nets and patrol vessels and, indicator loops and all these kind of systems that there's no way that anything could happen. So the only serious threat was the new threat from the air. As obviously there was a huge element of luck on the part of the U-47. I mean, they were very lucky not only to be able to get in to Scapa Flow, but also get back out again. Having achieved a successful attack. But yeah, it's one of these things that the Admiralty was utterly convinced was impossible. So it was such a shock when it did happen. And whilst I'm not saying the Admiralty didn't care, but obviously the shock was one thing, but the loss of 833 lives is even worse. So, that's, I think, certainly for the public, that was what made it all the worse.
And it made them react so fast, because just thinking about the speed of development, we mentioned the Royal Oak being sunk on the night of October 13th, 14th, 1939. Less than 6 months later, in March 1940, the first wave of bombers came over Orkney, with up to 60 at times, but in that brief period of several months on the winter of 39-40, so many anti-aircraft batteries were in place, and also the radar system then would have a vital role in giving them the information that they needed.
Yeah, I mean, the history of Netherbutton's kind of interesting because it was set up so quickly. It really was set up on an emergency basis. That the plan was, there was the three stations that I mentioned that were mobile equipment set up during the Munich crisis. The one in Yorkshire was a place called Ravenscar, but it was being replaced by a permanent station, with the 350-foot steel towers and all that kind of stuff. At Danby Beacon. So the station at Ravenscar was classed as surplus to requirements. So the plan was they would move that up to Netherbutton. The problem was Dowding, who was head of fighter command, and had, because he'd been air member for supply and research, he'd been involved in approving the development of radar and the procurement of Spitfires and Hurricanes. So he kind of set up the whole air defence system. Really, he refused to release Ravenscar early enough for it to go up to Netherbutton. So they had to get new. So the equipment was housed in wooden huts, So they got new huts made by the manufacturers. They got the towers, which were just 90-foot wooden towers, so much smaller than anything that people will recognise from photographs in Netherbutton. They came from Drone Hill, which is the station in Berwickshire to cover the Firth of Forth. And it was only the aerials and the transmitter and receiver that came from Yorkshire. So they basically, it's 3 different places that stuff came from. So stuff came from Ravenscar, stuff came from Drone Hill, and stuff came from the manufacturers. And it was all rushed up basically to Rosyth, and then yes, I'm sure I went to Rosyth rather than taking up to Scrapstone. I need to check. Yeah, basically shipped up to Orkney and set up on a very much an emergency basis. So they did some test flights just to make sure everything was okay, and handed it over to the RAF. There were challenges. The problem with these types of stations is the ideal kind of site is several miles from the sea, with basically gently nice, flat, sloping ground towards the sea. Now, anyone living in Orkney will know that there isn't anywhere in the islands that is several miles from the sea. So there wasn't anywhere in Orkney that really would have been the best place to build it. So Netherbutton was a bit of a compromise. As a result, its performance was never as good as it could have been if it had been on a perfect kind of site. And some people might have read, there's a book by Bill Hewison called This Great Harbour Scapa Flow, which is a very good book. And in that he quotes, I've forgotten his rank, was it Major Kemp, I think it was. He was the officer commanding Orkney and Shetland defences, and he was very critical of Netherbutton because in the flow at the time of the attacks in March and April 1940, there was an anti-aircraft cruiser, which was one of 4 cruisers that were converted as anti-aircraft cruisers. So they had a huge number of anti-aircraft guns. And HMS Curlew was stationed in the flow to provide extra anti-aircraft cover for Netherbutton, but also it had a naval radar, which I think was the Type 79. And according to the Admiralty, during the attacks, Netherbutton was pretty much useless, and all the early warning came from Curlew, which is interesting because as a result of, there was a lot of alarm bells, I think, went off at the Air Ministry, and they told the scientists to go and check and sort of get Netherbutton sorted and all that kind of stuff. And they sent people up and they did some trials, and they looked at the reports of what had happened and all that kind of stuff. And their reports that said, I think there was possibly one occasion where Curlew's performance was better than Netherbutton, but every other occasion Netherbutton performed far better than Curlew did. So I'm not saying that Netherbutton was perfect, but for those that have read Bill Hewson's really good book, I think it gives a bit of bad press to Netherbutton because it wasn't as bad as was made out. What helped was, as I say, the original, mobile equipment and wooden huts with these small wooden towers. When the final station, so the chain home had basically 3 stages. They had advance, which is what the mobile stuff was. There was intermediate, which was basically still in huts, but with better equipment and using the 240-foot wooden towers for both transmitting and receiving. And then the final station where you use the wooden towers, which were on the east side of the road, just for receiving, and the 350-foot towers that many might remember that were on the west side of the road, those were for transmitting. Once that station was finished, the performance was much better because it was much better equipment. The aerials higher up gave a much better range. And then Netherbutton became slightly unusual. I mean, it seems to only really have been in the Northern Isles that they had what were called all-round looking stations. The photograph that I mentioned earlier that they have in the library, if you look really closely, you'll see that the towers have platforms near the bottom at 50 feet. There's towers in the middle at 240 feet high, and then there's platforms almost at the top. And if you look at any photograph, any book about the Battle of Britain, the photographs, you'll see the towers and the platforms, are sort of between each of the towers, which is what they were originally at Netherbutton, but then they converted it. So these stations had what they called a line of shoot, which was the direction the radio energy was directed at, which would be at right angles to the line of the towers. So you'd have the aerials on sort of slung on the towers, and the radio energy would go out more or less at right angles. With Netherbutton, they turned the two end towers, the platforms were turned at 90 degrees. So therefore, the radar signal was then sent out, and if you imagine the towers on the line, instead of it being sent out that way, the end towers, it would go out in each direction at each end, and the two middle ones one would be essentially projecting forward, the other one backwards. So with the four towers, you'd be looking at in four directions at right angles to each other. So it basically meant instead of just looking at an area about 60 odd degrees in front of the station, it could look pretty much 360 degrees, which gave Netherbutton an ability to not just look at what might be coming from across the North Sea, but essentially coming in from the Western Atlantic, or from the mainland of Scotland. That certainly gave it an unusual ability.
So they're sweeping the skies for detecting incoming aircraft. When they do detect them, I guess the message then has to be sent out, well, to various places, of course, the anti-aircraft batteries in particular.
Again, all the kind of standard books will say that all the radar information was passed to Flight Command headquarters, which was Bentley Priory in northwest London, which for the majority of the chain was the case. When Netherbutton was set up, that was at a point where they realised there was too much information from all these stations coming in. So they were starting to set up what they called local filter rooms. So I mean, the idea was the radar information would go to a filter room, they would clean it up, work out the highly trained RAF officers and WAF officers who would work out what the true position of the aircraft was from how reliable different radar stations were. And that would then go to the operations room, which is what you kind of see in all the war films with the WAFs, with the croupiers' rakes and the officers looking down from above, deciding which squadrons to scramble to intercept. But it's the filter room where the radar information went into. And Flight Command headquarters was getting a bit inundated with all this information. So from 1940, they were starting to devolve that process and have each of the fighter groups that covered a different part were having to start and get their own filter rooms. With Netherbutton, that kind of happened before that sort of formal process started. So when it opened, well, it originally started as its own filter room, essentially. So there wasn't a filter room that it passed information to. In December 39, they set up. Well, there was basically a sector station at Wick. So in the school at Wick, they were sending the information to there, but between June and December, basically they would just have sort of phoned it through to, well, I mean, it would have been to that Admiral commanding Orkney and Shetland, which I suppose from would eventually have ended up in Iron Duke, but I can't remember who it was before that. I know certainly some of the smaller stations. I mean, there was Chainholme Low. There was a naval version of that called Coast Defence U-boat, which was detecting aircraft and surface U-boats. They were sending plots into HMS Greenwich in Scapa Flow, but I've not found any evidence that Netherbutton was as well. So it's not entirely clear what the correct. I don't think there was an official process. It was all a bit informal. But yeah, in December, once they set up the sector station at Wick, it went there, and then eventually that was transferred to Kirkwall, and eventually, when the Black Building was eventually built, which I don't think was until 1943, oddly enough, that became, the sector operations room, and also the gun operations room. So the anti-aircraft guns were controlled from there as well.
Now, we've talked about the technology and the various events, but the people would have played a vital role. To work as a member of the team at the Netherbutton radar station would be a big responsibility, because if anything were to slip, if any piece of equipment were to break down, it could mean that a squadron of bombers could arrive in Orkney with very little warning. So would it be that the team at Netherbutton had to be capable of keeping the station at the very highest levels of readiness and really solving whatever technical problem might arise at any time?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you would think, obviously the urgency with which it had been set up shows the priority that was given to radar warning. So you would think, obviously, something of this importance and this secrecy has got to be the responsibility of a fairly senior officer. But actually, that wasn't the case. Certainly with the early pre-war stations, it was NCOs, non-commissioned officers, that were in charge. So I mean, all the Thames Estuary chain that I mentioned, when they were first handed over to the RAF, there was a flight sergeant was the officer or non-commissioned officer in charge, with a corporal and a leading aircraftman. The flight sergeants flight sergeants tend to have years of experience under their belt, but most of them, if not all of them, were what they classed as wireless operator mechanics. So they had gone through years of training, mostly at the electrical and wireless school at RAF Flowerdown in England, and many of them had served overseas in the 20s and 30s, and all over the Empire, Iraq, India, various different places. So I mean, they generally had a wealth of experience, and when they they then set up those emergency stations at the time in Munich. The same applied. It was a flight sergeant, a corporal, and an LAC. That then brings us to Netherbutton. And for anyone who's read much about Netherbutton, the story goes that it was set up by a corporal, Leonard Chapman, and that's actually not the case. He was there, but because I've managed to get his service record from the RAF, which gives you details of all these postings and promotions. And I mean, he ended up as a squadron leader at the end of the war. He was serving at the base at Ravenscar in Yorkshire that I mentioned earlier. He was there at the time that Netherbutton was set up. So he didn't set it up. It was actually personnel from there was a special RAF unit set up to install all the radar stations called Number 2 Installation Unit. So it was personnel from there that took the equipment up to Netherbutton to set it up and handed it over. Leonard Chapman didn't actually get posted to Netherbutton until November, so he wasn't there until 5 months after the station had started. But in the documents, there was a flight sergeant, Nickel, was in charge. I've not been able to find out exactly who was all there and when, because the normal establishment would be a flight sergeant, corporal, and an LAC. That whether there was somebody else there before Chapman, which I would have thought would have been known about, I'm not quite clear on. But yeah, I mean, there was a flight sergeant in charge until, I'm trying to think, when was it? It was about March or April 1940, I think it was. There was a flight lieutenant, Clark, was posted in as the commanding officer. And, you know, I mean, eventually a chain home station would have about 200 personnel at it, with 3 or 4 different watches. And I mean, it was fairly well on before WAF. So it was all male. I'm trying to remember. Let me just check. Yeah, it was May 1942 before WAF personnel arrived at Netherbutton. So prior to that, it had been purely RAF male personnel.
And I was just thinking that was quite a good decision by the RAF. The fact that the flight lieutenants, the flight sergeants, the corporals were the people with the actual technical knowledge. So they were the appropriate people to put in position to set it up, to manage it, and so on. It would have been so easy to have got people higher up the ladder with no technical skills, but more status.
Well, yeah, I mean, interestingly, I mean, once the kind of proper establishment, with, you know, say about 200 odd personnel in place, the station commanders were non-technical, so they were from what they called the Administrative and Special Duties branch, whereas the mechanics, you know, they would have a technical officer, but he would be from the technical branch, so he would know all about radar and how it worked. But the station commander would basically be there to deal with all the administrative stuff, you know, like pay and rations and leave and all those mundane things, but very important if it concerns you. But because they weren't technical, they weren't actually allowed into the technical blocks where the secret equipment was. So, I mean, they would have passwords, and if you didn't have the password, you weren't allowed in. So, ironically, the person in charge of the station didn't really know what was going on, which is kind of seems very odd. But yeah, certainly, I mean, the early days, I mean, they actually set up, Bod's a research station, about the time that it sort of became an operational radar station, they actually had RAF personnel there doing courses, training all these personnel up on, what radar was, how it works, and, gave them all the technical knowledge. So, I mean, they would all have come from a wireless background. They would, probably been radio hams or had their own wireless business before the war and things like that. But radar was very new to them. So they were actually given very intensive training over about a month or so before they were then released on to running the stations themselves.
So it's fascinating in the lives of these people with all these great technical skills, which they deployed so ably. There must be all kinds of stories still waiting to be researched. So you've much more work to do yet, even.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things that I find is, I mean, you see in all the great films, the WAFs, as I say, in the operations rooms, and you'll see sort of the WAF on the radar screen, at the receiver, sort of talking about all the enemy aircraft coming in. It's less well known that certainly later on during the Second World War, many of the WAF radar operators retrained as radar mechanics, so they were actually doing the maintenance on the aerials and the transmitters and receivers, and very highly skilled technical work. And I find that interesting. Obviously the contribution of women in the First World War largely led to them, some women getting the vote in 1918. But I think it's not necessarily recognised so much that the role of women in the Second World War, that they weren't just releasing men to go to the front line, but they were actually doing increasingly highly skilled technical jobs. They weren't, when I say just drivers, I don't mean to denigrate the role of nurses or drivers or whatever, but you had women with maths degrees working at Bletchley Park, code breaking. You had women training as radar mechanics. Really highly skilled technical jobs, and I think that made a lot of difference after the Second World War in starting to recognise that women were capable of doing more than just basic jobs. They could do anything that a man could do, no matter how difficult.
Ian, it's a wonderful story that you've told, a wonderful picture that you've painted, and I'm just going to repeat the title of that book, Radar in Scotland, 1938 to 1946, published by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Ian, a very big thank you indeed for telling us a fascinating story. Thank you.